Daughter yelled. "You'll never replace my father, so don't even try." I gathered up all the expensive things, stopped paying for her studies, and left the bills for her real father. His indifference ended up being the most painful blow. Hit subscribe, drop your own stories in the comments, and let's begin. You'll never replace my father. Don't even try. The words ripped through the air, jagged and merciless. They came from Ellie, 16 years old that day, her hair done up in curls, her dress sparkling under the chandeliers I had paid to hang. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang out, sharp and deliberate, echoing off the restaurant walls I had rented to celebrate her birthday. And then Jason, older by 2 years but meaner by temperament, added his own venom, spitting it into the silence. "You're just a stranger who pays the bills." For a moment, all sound in that hall collapsed. The musicians froze mid-song, their instruments hanging in the air like useless ornaments. Guests shifted uneasily, pretending to look at their glasses, their plates, anywhere but at me. Even the waiters stopped moving, caught between duty and disbelief. And me? I stood there with a raised glass of champagne, the words "my daughter" still lingering on my tongue, half-spoken, unfinished. I had meant them to be a gift, a claim, a public declaration that after years of sacrifice, I considered Ellie mine. That she was more than Sarah's daughter or Paul's abandoned child. That she was family. But her reply cut through me like a blade. "My name is Michael. I'm 43 years old, an architect by trade. For 5 years, I had been Sarah's husband, a husband who came with not just vows, but obligations. Sarah had 2 children when I married her. Jason, 15 at the time, and Ellie, 13. Their father, Paul, lived in another state. He appeared only when it suited him, drifting in on holidays with gifts that looked generous but were cheap at heart. He never stayed longer than a few hours, never remembered their schedules, never paid their bills. He lived as a ghost, and yet he was still Dad. I told myself I could fill the void he left. I told myself presence was louder than absence, that consistency would win where neglect had failed. I became the one paying the rent on our Atlanta home, the one covering school trips, medical bills, after-school activities. I was there for late-night fevers and broken bones, for homework meltdowns, for games and recitals that Paul never once showed up to. When Jason turned 16, I bought him his first car. When Ellie wanted to join dance, I paid for the classes, the shoes, the endless costumes. I believed, foolishly, that love, given in abundance, would eventually be recognized. That patience, if stretched long enough, would be rewarded with belonging. I thought if I gave them stability, gave them comfort, gave them more than they ever asked for, one day they would look at me and see not the man who replaced their father, but the man who became their father. And so, on Ellie's 16th birthday, I planned something extravagant. I rented out an entire restaurant hall, decorated it with flowers, hired musicians, invited her friends, her classmates, her teachers, her mother's friends, even distant relatives. I wanted the world to see how cherished she was. I wanted her to know, without question, that she mattered. The night began perfectly. Laughter filled the hall, music swirled. Ellie's friends squealed at the sight of the chocolate fountain. Jason strutted with the confidence of a boy who had everything handed to him. Sarah smiled, at least on the surface, watching from her seat with a glass of wine in hand. When it came time for the toast, I stood tall, my glass raised high. The speech had been rehearsed in my head 100 times. I spoke about Ellie's kindness, her resilience, her bright future. I spoke of her as if she were mine because, in every way that mattered, I had treated her as such. And then I said it, the words that had sat heavy in my chest for years, waiting to be freed. My daughter. I meant it as love. I meant it as recognition. And Ellie's rejection came swift and merciless. You'll never replace my father. Don't even try. Jason's smirk followed, poisonous. You're just a stranger who pays the bills. There it was. Years of sacrifice erased in 2 sentences. But what broke me wasn't their cruelty. Children lash out. Teenagers wound without understanding the depth of their blade. What broke me was Sarah. She didn't rush to my defense. She didn't chastise them. She didn't even look embarrassed. She shrugged, swirling her wine, her lips curling into a dismissive smile. Well, she said almost casually, they do have a father. That was her verdict. That was her truth. That no matter what I had done, no matter what I had given, Paul would always outrank me. Blood over labor, absence over presence. The hall buzzed again. Conversations stuttered back to life. Music stumbled awkwardly into motion. But in my ears, there was only silence. A silence that grew heavier with every passing second. I stood there, my glass raised, my heart hollow, my pride bleeding out in front of an audience that pretended not to see. I lowered the glass without drinking. I sat down without finishing my toast. And I watched Ellie beam as her friends crowded her. Jason laugh as though he had won some contest. Sarah sip her wine as though nothing had happened. That night, when the party was over and the guests had gone home, I lay awake beside Sarah. She slept soundly, her breath steady, her body turned away from me. I stared at the ceiling, my chest burning. The words repeated in my head, over and over, louder than the silence of the empty house. You'll never replace my father. You're just a stranger who pays the bills. Well, they do have a father. I realized then what I had refused to admit for years. I was not a father. I was not even a stepfather. I was a man performing unpaid labor under the guise of love. I was a wallet, a chauffeur, a convenient placeholder for the man they still worshipped despite his absence. And in that dark silence, I felt something in me turn cold. Not broken, not yet, but hardened. A seed of resolve, buried deep, waiting for the moment it would rise. The turning point had come. The morning after Ellie's birthday, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The house was quiet. Sarah was still in bed, her phone clutched in her hand like a shield. Jason and Ellie slept late, wrapped in the comfort I had provided. But I couldn't sleep. I hadn't closed my eyes once. Instead, I pulled out a stack of papers I hadn't touched in years, bank statements, receipts, account summaries. I brought out a calculator, an old one with buttons worn from use. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, then forced myself to add them up. For years, that was the length of my marriage when I began counting. 4 years of expenses for 2 children who reminded me at every opportunity that I wasn't their father. Tuition fees, insurance payments, sports activities, medical bills, clothes, trips, birthdays, phones, gas for Jason's car, dance shoes for Ellie. The final number was obscene. $80,000. More than I had ever spent on myself. More than I had saved for my own future. Money poured into a black hole of entitlement and disdain. I stared at the number until my stomach turned. 80,000. And what had I bought with it? Nothing but contempt. Nothing but shrugs and smirks. Nothing but 2 sentences at a birthday party that told me I was invisible. It wasn't just the money. It was time. It was years of driving them to practices, of sitting in waiting rooms during appointments, of staying up late to review essays Jason couldn't be bothered to finish. It was hours bent over Ellie's costume ribbons with Sarah, only for Ellie to roll her eyes the next day and mutter that Dad would have bought her something better. Every sacrifice had been rebranded as obligation. My presence was invisible, my effort expected, and in that moment I decided I wasn't going to keep paying for my own humiliation. The first step was simple. I logged into Jason's car insurance account. It was my name on the policy, my card that made the monthly payments. I deleted the card information, clicked cancel, and watched as the confirmation appeared. Just like that, Jason's freedom was gone. Next came Ellie's dance studio. Auto debits linked to my checking account. I removed them all. Without those payments, she wouldn't be stepping into that studio again. Her name would vanish from their roster like chalk washed from pavement. Then the phones. Both children had the latest iPhones, courtesy of my labor. They texted, scrolled, streamed without a second thought, their screens glowing late into the night while I worked overtime to keep the bills paid. I called the provider, confirmed my identity, and disconnected them both. 2 clicks, 2 silences. Health insurance, gone. Tutoring payments, gone. Allowances, gone. I spent the entire morning cutting threads. One by one, I severed the invisible ties that had bound me to their comfort. By the time Sarah stumbled into the kitchen around noon, rubbing her eyes and yawning, I was finished. "What are you doing?" she asked, glancing at the pile of papers spread across the table. "Balancing the books," I said flatly. She poured herself coffee, barely listening. That was her way, ignoring the labor until it failed. She didn't notice the absence of numbers on the pages, didn't ask why I was pale, why my eyes hadn't closed all night. She kissed my shoulder half-heartedly and went back upstairs. By the end of that week, the fallout began. Jason was the first to feel it. He came storming into the kitchen one afternoon, his car keys jingling angrily in his hand. "They canceled my insurance," he shouted, his voice high with disbelief. "I can't drive without it. What the hell happened?" I looked up from the newspaper, calm. "Not my problem anymore. Ask your father." Jason blinked, stunned. "Dad? He doesn't even live here. He won't." He cut himself off, realizing too late what he was admitting. His voice dropped into a growl. "You can't just drop me like that. I need my car." "No," I said evenly. "You wanted me to be just a stranger who pays bills. Strangers don't buy insurance for teenage boys who mock them. Ask your father." Jason stormed off, slamming doors hard enough to rattle the walls. But his car stayed parked, unmoving, a silent monument to his arrogance. Ellie was next. On Tuesday evening, Sarah drove her to the dance studio as usual. She came home an hour later, mascara smeared, her dress wrinkled from sitting on the curb. "They said I couldn't come back until my fees are paid," she whispered, her voice trembling. I looked at her across the room. Her eyes, once bright with contempt, now shimmered with confusion. "Then talk to your father," I told her. She glanced at Sarah, who stayed silent, her lips pressed tight. Then Ellie's gaze flicked back to me. "But he doesn't pay for anything." "Then maybe you'll finally understand what that means," I said. The phones were cut a day later. Jason cursed, stomping through the house, demanding Wi-Fi passwords and muttering about how I was ruining his life. Ellie cried quietly in her room, staring at a black screen she could no longer use to reach her friends. Each overdue notice that came in the mail, I collected neatly. I didn't hide them. I stacked them on the counter, thick envelopes stamped with "final notice" and "cancellation warning." And when the pile grew large enough to lean, I slid them into one big envelope, scrawled "Paul" across the front, and mailed them straight to the man whose blood they worshipped. Within days, his mailbox overflowed. Neighbors began to complain about the stack of letters spilling onto his porch, stamped and unpaid. I imagined him standing there, flipping through the bills, cursing my name. But it wasn't my name on those children's birth certificates. It wasn't my duty. Not anymore. The house turned sour. Jason glared at me across the dinner table, his eyes full of hatred he couldn't voice. Ellie sat in silence, her fork pushing food she no longer enjoyed. Sarah grew colder, her smiles fewer, her voice clipped. She never confronted me directly, but I caught her watching me with suspicion, as though waiting for me to soften, to undo what I had done. But I didn't. I sat tall, calm, unshaken, because for the first time in years, I wasn't bleeding out for people who despised me. For the first time in years, I wasn't a slave to their entitlement. The bills would keep coming. The debts would grow. Paul would eventually have to face the truth of his absence. And the children, for the first time, would have to look at the empty space where their father should have been. And when they did, they would remember me. Not as the man who paid, but as the man who finally stopped. Paul arrived with fury. It was a humid Saturday afternoon when his rusting sedan pulled into our driveway, its exhaust coughing like an old smoker. He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. In his hand was a stack of bills. Envelopes torn, creased, stamped with red ink that screamed, "Final notice." He stormed toward the front door like a man ready for war. Sarah opened it before he could knock. She froze when she saw him, her lips parting soundlessly. "Where the hell do you get off dumping this on me?" Paul barked, shoving the stack against her chest. His voice carried into the house, loud enough to shake the picture frames on the walls. I came out of the kitchen, calm, deliberate. I had been waiting for this. Paul turned on me instantly, his face red, his eyes *T. You think you can just mail me bills like I'm some goddamn bank? These are your responsibility. You married her. You took this on. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I only said, "No, Paul. These are your children. I carried your weight for years out of goodwill. But they made it clear, I'm not their father. So now it's your turn." Behind him, Jason and Ellie stood at the edge of the kitchen, eavesdropping. Their faces pale, their bodies stiff. For the first time, I saw something new in their eyes. Not defiance, not arrogance, but doubt. Paul's jaw tightened. You don't get to just walk away. You think you can play house, pretend you're the dad, then dump it all back on me when you get tired? That's not how it works. I stepped closer, my voice steady, low. I never pretended, Paul. I showed up. Every day. Every bill. Every fever. Every practice. I was there. And when I finally called Ellie my daughter, she spat in my face. Jason called me a stranger who pays the bills. Sarah shrugged and said, "They do have a father." I pointed at the stack of overdue notices crumpled in Sarah's hands. "That's you. That's what a father is, according to them. So take it. Take all of it." Paul's eyes flickered, rage and shame twisting together. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. From the kitchen doorway, Jason shifted uncomfortably. His bravado was gone. He glanced at Ellie, whose lips trembled as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. They were watching their idol, the man they defended, the ghost they worshipped, and seeing him for what he was, a coward with no answers. Ellie broke first. That evening, she came to me. Her phone had gone dark days ago, and she had been cut off from her friends, her classes, her tiny world. She found me in the study, where I sat in silence with my drafting board. Her eyes were red. "I didn't want you to stop caring about us," she whispered. I put down my pencil. "I haven't stopped caring. I just stopped volunteering for disrespect." Her shoulders shook. "Dad hasn't even called. Not once. I thought." She cut herself off, the word catching in her throat. I leaned back, my voice measured. "That's because caring and claiming aren't the same thing, Ellie. He claimed you, cared for you, but you wanted him, not me." She stared at me, her face pale, the weight of realization pressing on her young shoulders. I don't know what I want anymore." I let the silence sit. I wanted her to feel the gravity of that confession. Then I said, "You'll get your phone back, but there's a condition." She looked up quickly, hope flashing. "What?" "Respect," I said. "That's the price. No more contempt. No more treating me like furniture. You want connection? You pay for it with respect." Her lips quivered, but she nodded. The next morning, her phone was restored. She clutched it like a lifeline, but for once, she didn't retreat into her screen. She lingered in the kitchen, her eyes following me, uncertain but softer than before. Jason, however, held out. He sulked in silence, his car parked dead in the driveway, dust gathering on the hood. He muttered under his breath, glared at me over dinner, whispered complaints to Sarah when he thought I wasn't listening. He believed endurance would win. He believed I would eventually cave, as I always had. But then the job cracked him. He had been working part-time at a cafe across town. It wasn't much, just enough for gas, the occasional night out, a taste of independence. But when his car insurance was canceled, he lost his right to drive. And when he lost the car, he lost the job. One evening, I found him sitting on the porch, his head in his hands. His pride had deflated. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I can't get to work anymore," he muttered. I stood beside him, my arms crossed. "Then get a ride from your father." He didn't look up. "He won't. He doesn't care." I said nothing. The silence stretched until he cracked further. "You were the only one who was always there," he whispered. The words hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, he wasn't sneering, wasn't mocking. He was confessing. I didn't embrace him. I didn't soften. I only said, "Now you see the truth." It took losing everything to realize it. "But maybe it isn't too late if you respect me." He looked up then, his eyes wet. He didn't say the word Dad. Not yet. But the defiance in his face was gone. Inside the house, Sarah watched from the window. She didn't intervene. She didn't speak. Her silence, once a wee *p*n, now betrayed something else, fear. She saw her children shifting, the balance changing, their loyalty trembling. Paul never returned. He stayed in his other state, unreachable, unbothered. His silence was his answer. His absence was his truth. And slowly, Jason and Ellie began to see me not as a stranger who paid bills, but as the man who had always carried them when no one else did. But I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't beg for their recognition. I let them come to me, broken, humbled, forced to face what love without respect had cost them. Because sometimes the only way to teach the value of presence is to take it away. Jason broke slower than Ellie. He resisted longer, clung tighter to the illusion that he could outlast me, that if he ignored my boundaries I would eventually fold. But time wears down even the most stubborn walls. And reality doesn't negotiate. He stopped working at the cafe after losing his insurance. At first, he framed it as a choice, as if he had quit out of boredom. He walked around the house bragging that he was done with that crappy job anyway. But the truth showed in the hollow of his eyes, the way his phone sat dark and unused, the way his nights grew quiet. He had no money of his own. He couldn't fill his tank. He couldn't go anywhere without asking Sarah for rides. One evening, I came home late from a site inspection and found him sitting in the driveway, slumped against his car, keys dangling from his hand. The defiance was gone. He didn't even look up when I approached. "Problem?" I asked, my voice level. He sighed, his voice cracking with the weight of something he hadn't wanted to admit. "You were the only one who was always there." The same words he had muttered weeks earlier, but this time they carried weight, sincerity, surrender. He wasn't just angry or lost anymore. He was broken. I studied him for a long moment. "Respect, Jason. That's the price. You don't have to call me your father. You don't even have to like me. But if you want my help, you will show respect. Every time. Without fail." He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine. And in that moment, I knew the tide had turned. Ellie had already begged *n to change. With her phone restored, she had tested my boundaries at first, pushing with sarcasm, trying to provoke me. But each time I held the line. Each time I reminded her, respect or nothing. Eventually, she bent. She started to say thank you when I drove her places. She asked how my day had been. Small things, almost trivial, but they mattered. They were signs of a shift. Together, the two of them began to inch toward me. Not with open arms, not with the blind devotion they once reserved for their absent father, but with cautious steps. Steps that acknowledged me not as a stranger, not as a wallet, but as something more solid. Sarah, however, remained the thorn. She watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and bitterness. She wanted her children cared for, but she also resented that I had wrestled authority away from her silence. She had been comfortable with me as the provider, the one who gave endlessly while she stood aside. My boundaries exposed her complicity, her willingness to let me suffer so she didn't have to confront the truth of her children's disdain. One night, when the kids were in their rooms, she confronted me in the kitchen. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "You went too far, Michael. Cutting them off, humiliating them like that, you traumatized them." I leaned against the counter, my tone cold. "No, Sarah. They traumatized themselves the day they looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing. I gave them the lesson their father never would. Words have consequences. Respect isn't optional." She shook her head, tears brimming. "They're just kids. They're old enough to drive cars, demand money, dream of college," I replied. "Old enough to hurt me with their words. Old enough to learn that the world doesn't bend just because they're young." Sarah said nothing after that. She turned away, her silence heavy. And I knew our marriage was fractured beyond repair. She had chosen to side with passivity, with excuses, while I had chosen clarity. Paul never came back. After his outburst with the bills, he vanished again, proving what I had always known. His fatherhood was a title without substance. Jason and Ellie could no longer deny it. They saw him for what he was, a shadow, a man who appeared only to protest, never to provide. And so, slowly they shifted toward me. They began to call me their father, not dad. Not yet, but my father. The distinction mattered. It wasn't love they were offering, not entirely. It was recognition. And recognition was enough. I didn't rush to embrace them. I didn't buy new cars or reinstate allowances. I restored what was essential: insurance, medical coverage, phones, but nothing more. Every privilege had to be earned. Every word, every action had to prove that they understood the line I had drawn. And for the first time, they began to rise to meet it. Jason started working again, this time at a construction supply store. He came home exhausted, his hands raw, but he didn't complain. When I asked him how his shift had gone, he answered respectfully. Not warmly, not yet, but without contempt. That was progress. Ellie went back to her classes eventually, not through Sarah's pleading or Paul's money, but through her own humility. She asked me directly, her voice soft, her eyes steady. Please, I'll be better. And she was. She began to check in with me before rehearsals, thanking me after every ride. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't the family I once fantasized about, but it was something real. And Paul? He remains distant, cold, indifferent. A man who fathered 2 children but never raised them. A man who left the heavy lifting to me, then resented me for doing it. His absence now speaks louder than any gift he could bring. Jason and Ellie know it. They don't say it aloud, but I see it in the way their eyes harden when his name comes up. As for Sarah, she lives in the shadows of her choices. She has tried, in small ways, to bridge the gap, cooking more dinners, initiating conversations. But trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. I don't know if our marriage will survive. Perhaps it already ended that night at Ellie's party, when she shrugged and told me, well, they do have a father, but I survived. And more than that, I found clarity. I learned the truth that so many fear to admit. Love without boundaries turns into unpaid labor. A man who gives endlessly without demand for respect is not a father, not even a husband. He is a servant. And servants are disposable. But once you set limits, once you draw the line and enforce it without flinching, the world around you begins to shift. Even those who rejected you, who mocked you, who spat in your face, begin to see your worth. Because worth is not proven by how much you give. It is proven by how much you refuse to give away for free. Now, Jason and Ellie call me their father. Not by blood, but by choice, by recognition. That is enough. For them, respect came at a price. For me, peace came at a cost. And so I end with this question, the one that haunts me even as I stand firmer than ever. Was I wrong? Was I cruel to force them to face the void their real father left behind? Or was it the only way to teach them that respect has a price, and I was done paying it in silence?